Last week, the former UK Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair and the former would-be Conservative Prime Minister William Hague, having spent a good part of their political lives opposing each other, produced a joint report calling for a British technology revolution. And it's interesting, some of the response to this, particularly on the populist right, was that this is the face of technocracy. Partly it's true, partly it's not. And that ambiguity is a real one that's at the heart of the arguments about individual freedom and national identity on the one hand versus global technocracy on the other. I find myself torn because I think both sides are blind to the best arguments of the other side. I think we're also at a time of great opportunity, but also huge risk, not least risk that we will blow the opportunities that we do have by behaving in the most stupid ways that our species can devise. So let's talk about technology and freedom and where they may and may not meet in the middle. Let me start by trying to summarise the spirit of the Tony Blair William Hague document. First, a few statements I think it would be hard to argue with. One, a number of key emerging technologies are clearly going to be driving the wealth creation of the next period. These include artificial intelligence and all its applications, biotechnology, and climate tech and clean tech. Two, the UK has been a leader in those new technologies in the past, they say, although you can still see some of the inheritance of that position for whatever reasons, the UK's comparative advantages are eroding, not increasing. Their first proposition is, unsurprisingly, that should change. In order for it to change, government needs to commit more fully to supporting technology and innovation, which it currently fails to do because the Treasury imposes a 1 year at a time accountancy mindset to it. So, companies and opportunities naturally go elsewhere, particularly to the United States. Now, that seems a point solidly made. I don't think there's a huge amount of controversy about that in principle. They point out that the UK government bureaucracy is bloated and painfully slow to do anything, which is not a novel observation and hard to dispute. They make the easy contrast with how quickly the COVID vaccine development and rollout was achieved specifically and deliberately by exempting it from civil service procedures. The next core proposition then is that we should go further and technology should now revolutionise the state, changing how government does its business. And this, as you might expect, is where we start crossing a few lines. And for all that people want to impugn malign intent on such things, the truth is that there are excellent reasons supporting at least most of the proposals, so long as you don't ask certain questions. So, for example, they argue that the current system of government, where we put members of parliament who have no technological expertise whatsoever in charge of departments making complex decisions about investments in technology, this doesn't make sense. And that's kind of true. You only have to look at some of the thrashing about of ministers trying to work out how to regulate the risks of social media when they patently have no clue whatsoever about how it even works. I was talking just last week about the US Supreme Court admitting the cluelessness of the 9 justices when it came to questions about social media regulation. So, say Blair and Hague, we should have expert executive decision-making. People qualified and knowledgeable so better and faster decisions can be made. That sounds as though it must be right. People who know what they're doing surely must be better trusted to make good decisions than people with no clue, at least when it comes to complex matters. But there's a huge but. With a recent example of decision-making, for instance, during the pandemic, you have to be able to answer the question, what went wrong? because largely politicians handed their responsibility to their scientific advisors, to the experts, and we got a terrible, chaotic process. I mean, for goodness sake, we had ministers pronouncing on how large a meal you had to eat in order to be able to go into a pub. A Scotch egg was just big enough. It was determined. And how did we know? Because the science said so. Now, there's a huge amount of detail in what did and didn't go wrong during that time. People who took a strong position one way or the other have found various justifications as to why they were right all along and the other side was wholly wrong. But it seems to me that there were some highly relevant, important things that obviously went wrong. First, ministers failed in their duty to exercise democratic and multidisciplinary oversight. And they failed to frame the questions to be answered around the maximum public good. Science is a process of answering questions with reference to evidence. It neither tells you what the question should be, nor what you should do with the information you get back. But we ended up with experts defining the parameters of a question by default. Public policy wasn't framed as maximising the public good during a time of pandemic. If it had been defined that way, you would have needed to answer the question as to the short, medium and long-term costs of lockdown proposals, so that you could at least try to weigh those against the expected benefits of various degrees of severity of lockdown policies, or indeed their absence. But it wasn't. Graphs produced by epidemiologists were allowed to drive political decision-making, so by default you ended up focused on a single variable problem, the one that involves epidemiology, namely how to reduce deaths only from COVID-19. Not how to reduce deaths, not how to reduce deaths from COVID-19 while keeping businesses, livelihoods and mental health outcomes as good as possible, just for one variable, minimise deaths from COVID. Now that was the result of putting experts de facto in charge. The problem with expertise is that it will strongly value the relevance and importance of its very specific focus. It may be blind to factors that lie outside of that focus. We have the same problem clearly evident in a lot of how policy responding to climate change is being discussed. Again, logically, the exam question is to tackle the problem of climate change by ending emissions and building adaptation and resilience, while maximising the success and well-being of people and the economy and preserving biodiversity. But again, for too many people, it's a single variable problem. End the production of CO2 emissions at any cost. So we have a challenge here. Politicians are capable of making supremely dumb decisions when put in areas they don't understand. We'd like to avoid that if possible, but at least they are accountable to their electorate. They have to pay attention, eventually anyway, to the impacts on them. But does that mean it wouldn't be better to have decision makers who weren't as dumb as rocks, who, while not necessarily being specialists, were at least able to understand the key issues, some of the complexities and their implications? Well, of course. But unless you take that as a challenge to raise the quality of elected politicians, which is a very valid discussion for another day, then your answers to that all break the chain of accountability back to the electorate. And that would be a dubious thing to do, even if you could point to a brilliant track record of delivery by experts in places of decision making. But you can't. In the US, we had doctors and other medical health professionals patently being partisan, saying that outdoor gatherings to protest lockdown policies or to support Donald Trump or whatever were terrible, unforgivable infection risks, but large, dense crowds of people to protest for Black Lives Matter, they were just fine. Nothing brought the idea of technocracy into greater disrepute than that one highly visible discrepancy. So yes, this is the challenge we have. We do not trust that the presence of expertise behind the closed doors of the offices of power necessarily leads to better quality decision-making on behalf of the people. And none of that, by the way, has anything to do with the conspiracy versions of that distrust. Sure, there are people who think that the vaccines kill babies and the politicians who produce them eat the babies that survived. You don't need to be anywhere near that group to be concerned about how this plays out. This finds its next expression in one of the other proposals that Tony Blair and William Hague put forward, that for the digital ID for every citizen. Now again, at one level, the arguments for this are patently common sense and unarguable, until you ask certain questions. So the case goes like this. So many of the services we use now, paying for goods, various forms of ID for services, access to events, are held on our electronic devices. So it would be much more sensible and efficient to have access to government services in the same seamless way. And that would be facilitated by having a central digital ID set up, which could be designed to guarantee privacy while also being incredibly useful. And in a world where we didn't have to worry about government tyranny, that would be a solid argument, definitely. Just like in a world where we don't have to worry about hackers, the most cost-effective and efficient system for networked computers is a high-trust, low-security model. But as the computer science pioneers of the 1970s onwards discovered, that's not the world we live in at all. I mean, we didn't know we had hackers back then, to be fair, but we should have realised that we had human beings who are minded to test boundaries wherever they find them. If people are outside of a system, they test for boundaries that are erected to keep them out. If they are inside of a system, they test for boundaries that constrain what they're allowed to do within or on behalf of the system. And therein lies the problem. In a world where our government couldn't be tempted into tyranny, then sure, it wouldn't be an issue. I don't believe any of our current politicians look in the mirror and imagine that they're seeing tyrants staring back at them. But we've already seen how a culture of technocracy tempts people into testing those boundaries. We had vaccination status used, albeit only briefly, unless your name was Novak Djokovic, in which case it lasted quite a long time, to limit the access to basic freedoms on a preferential basis. It was done in order to push those who, for whatever reason, did not want to get vaccinated, to do so, in order to gain the full set of privileges available to those who complied. Now, you can come back with all your public health justifications for that, why you think it was the right policy, why those people were being, in your opinion, terribly selfish, or whatever it might be, so on and so on. The point is that given even a faint wisp of a formal identification process, the government quickly leapt into toying with using it to compel behaviours that, let's face it, were not legally required. Now you can do that, but the consequence is that nobody then trusts you not to exercise tyranny with new digital powers when they get handed to you. Because we've seen how this can work. In China, with social credit points handed out to those who are good citizens. Right now, we officially think that's terrible. But there are lots of little steps, dare I say nudges, that could push us little by little in that direction. And we've seen in the West how uncertain are the presumptions that many of us had that we could never go that way. After all, we didn't think democracies could or should impose lockdowns until someone, democratic, Italy, did, copying Beijing's model. How quickly that transformed from something everyone assumed couldn't be done to something that was held to be so self-evidently the right thing to do, you could demonise people, like the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, who argued, rightly or wrongly, for an alternative approach. In their report, Blair and Hague say that President Xi Jinping of China believes that AI and the technological revolution suits autocracies at the expense of democracies. And they say Joe Biden is determined to prove him wrong, and this is part of the driver for America's focus and investment. All of which has a touching faith that we know we could never stray from the path of the righteous and be tempted to use the sort of technologies that China is utilising against its own people. Blair and Hague make no reference to the current culture wars and the cancel culture phenomenon that's been a key area of debate over the last few years. But the idea of punishing people, getting them fired, making it impossible for them to make a future living because of something they said or an opinion they hold, that has been going on with very patchy pushback from the political classes. And add to that the tech companies that have been banning people or suspending them from services for breaches of the rules, often not even explaining what they were. That's another great look, apparently, custom designed to dissuade you from trusting the judgment of expert power that gets wielded in reference only to itself. So it doesn't feel as though it's more than a few baby steps for that mindset to get a grip of something like digital ID and find virtuous sounding ways to wield it as a club against anyone they choose. Now look, so far that's a straight rehearsal of some of the most sensible objections to creeping technocracy. But you know what? On its own, it's not good enough. Because the world really is changing around us. Pretending it isn't, we could just carry on worrying about the things that we always used to worry about, things like the size of the state, the primacy of the market, all those things. That's not an option anymore. Because for one thing, artificial intelligence is a game changer. And it's one that you don't want to simply gift supremacy of to your competitors. And it ought to help us to solve some of those problems of, for instance, the ever-growing and bloated state. It could be part of the solution. What is the best way to organise a resource-limited health service to provide maximum human well-being? That's the sort of complex question that big blundering bureaucracy makes an incredibly bad job of, but self-learning artificial intelligence systems might be able to help with. Now, of course, you keep human decision makers involved. You use the analytic systems to review the data and make sense of it on your behalf. You don't want AI making day-to-day life or death decisions about which treatments get provided to who and under what basis. Or do you? I mean, I probably don't. Maybe the newest generation of people that grows up with the technology will be more open to that idea. Things change. Now, the standard debates are about whether you get a more effective system through central planning, the left-wing preference, versus creating some sort of internal market mechanisms to get resources allocated on the basis of need, or indeed some sort of continental insurance-based system, the right-wing preference. Sorry, America, no one in the UK wants your version of health insurance. A discussion for another time, perhaps. But all that standard debate has been about, at heart, what system will deliver genuinely the most efficient and effective healthcare. Central planning, centralised decision making and all that comes with it generally has some things to commend it, but has a track record of many, many failures and inefficiencies. But you can see how many left-leaning technocrats would jump on the idea of AI analysis as maybe solving some of those downsides, making that central planning really smart. Those on the other side could counter that it depends on the question the AI is asked to solve. Because you could ask it, given how humans follow incentives, how it would devise a system that naturally tends to lead human beings to make better decisions on the ground. In other words, to devise the ideal market-based system of healthcare, not to become the brain of the centralised one. This isn't currently how AI is being talked about in relation to healthcare. Right now it's focusing on the easy stuff, the on-the-ground treatment-related benefits. Using machine learning to detect and identify diseases quicker, providing personalised treatment plans for patients, automating processes such as identifying candidate drugs for different conditions and so on. All of that is revolutionary in itself, and not, as far as I can see, the sort of thing that should excite those fears of the AI-driven anti-democratic technocracy. But of course, people are also asking questions about AI in policy. Back in 2018, there was this paper, Transforming Health Policy Through Machine Learning, that looks at how AI could inform how government goes about prevention, protection, promotion, advocacy, and then at the sharp end, health interventions. But you can see where that goes. Because the truth is, the biggest impact we can make on our own health and well-being is to do all the lifestyle things that the health community keeps banging on about. Eat a good diet, regularly exercise, get plenty of sleep, don't smoke, don't drink to excess, don't give yourself permission to become obese. There's no getting away from it. Those things are the most powerful interventions you can make, especially as you get older. So that leads us naturally to the AI-driven nanny state, where we are given personalised instructions based on our genetic makeup and our current biological state on what we should and should not do if we want to be healthy. It doesn't have to go there, but the pure logic takes you there. So it's not irrational. If that's an outcome you fear could go wrong, it's not irrational to fear that that is where it will be driven. By the way, I say that as someone who loves technology and fully intends to take advantage of any advances that will give me information to manage my health as well as possible. I intend to be active and engaged in the world for decades to come. So sure, anything that's going to help me do that. But then what I want and what the government should mandate, they are two different things, because many people would want to make a different choice. Now, of course, some way down the line, inevitably, people start raising the question that if your personal choices mean higher costs for the health service, should you be punished in some way or disincentivized? Which is where we ended up with vaccine passports. So let's not think it would take so long to get there once you had this sort of system in place. But this is just one area. We have declining birth rates in developed countries, so an ageing population and a reducing number of younger working age people. Of course, AI and automation is going to be essential to raise the productivity of the economy to enable that. I mean, obviously, on the populist right, all you currently see on that situation is a bit of moral panic and the urging that people should be having more babies. But if China can't get its people to have more babies, various European countries that have tried to incentivise more births have failed to achieve it, at some point you have to recognise that right now aggregate freedom of human choice is leading in that direction. I'm one of those who thinks that eventually that was going to happen, because at some point the growth in human numbers has to stop. I mean, you can have arguments between the Malthusians who say we're already past the point and we need to shrink quickly, versus the techno-optimists who say that as we increased our world's carrying capacity in the past, so we can in the future. The point is, though, the growth stops at some point. It has to, because if it didn't, eventually you'd end up with everyone stood shoulder to shoulder, unable to move. And most people would acknowledge that the hard carrying capacity limit of the world, wherever it may actually lie, would be passed long before we got to that point. Once we've agreed that yes, there's a line somewhere, then you accept that part of the maturing of the human race is going to be learning to thrive at a steady state population number. That's a problem that is probably only solvable with the power of AI to increase productivity without human involvement. But if someone said that recently at Davos, and I haven't checked, but I wouldn't be surprised if somebody did, then you can imagine how that would be interpreted by those fearful of where this goes. And we haven't even touched yet on biotech. One thing that Tony Blair and William Hague don't touch upon in their document are the changes coming to longevity science, the likelihood that technology is going to be able to expand human lifespans. Yeah, probably too late for old crusties like me to benefit from. Curse you all! Although I monitor events with interest, because I've told you before I intend to live to 140. Still a long shot for me, possibly not so much for the kids of today. If you can persuade them they won't all be slaughtered by climate change before they get there, of course. That change will also have profound repercussions, worth a video or 10 all of its own. And again, unless your group, left-wing or right-wing, is going to voluntarily reject technology that could give you decades of extra high-quality life, then this is a technology that's going to be massively accepted and embraced, and is going to be scarily transformative. So this is my dilemma. I am a techno-optimist. I'm excited about the development of technology and what it will enable us to do. I am also a human governance pessimist, trending. Our ability collectively to take those benefits and massively screw up the opportunities and find new ways to create downsides, whether to make more profit or because of our determined tribalism, well, we all know how we can grasp defeat from the jaws of victory if we try hard enough. Just as an example, think about the political dynamic of increased longevity. Older people tend to vote more right-leaning. Older people are also more inclined to vote at all. So if you suddenly get fewer old people dying off at a time when fewer young people are being born, would left-wing parties see that as a threat to their ability ever to be elected again in the future? Might they not find ways to ensure that the real benefits of longevity were available, ironically, only to the uber-rich in order to prevent that from happening? I mean, it could go the other way. There are a dozen different permutations of how it could play out. The point is, the technology is about to change the historical equations, the very nature of what makes human society work. Ignoring that isn't an option. Your competitors who don't ignore it will probably wipe the floor with you. So we have to work this out. How do democracies make their peace with the transformative technology that's coming, hopefully avoiding it destroying ourselves along the way, but also avoiding proving Xi Jinping right when he says it will favour autocrats, because elements of it trend that way on their face. So if you don't want that to be the case, you're going to have to put the work in to establish what the alternative looks like. Or are the populists simply going to lose on this? Because they do seem to follow the course most likely to guarantee failure. If you simply reject new technologies, they won't stop just because you did that. If you pretend problems like climate change don't exist, they don't go away, and others will benefit from developing the solutions while you're sitting on your hands. So if they fail to step up, and in the absence of a more competent opposition, then we head into the technocracy, whether we choose it or not. In that case, will we avoid the dystopian vision that's easy to call to mind, or are we in for an interesting chapter in human history? Of course, this is big picture, long-term stuff. It is a long way from the detail of what Tony Blair and William Hague just released. And the kickback against what they released, for instance, this piece in The Telegraph, is very much on the basis of old-style discussions. Should the government be choosing technology winners and losers, simply staying out the way while entrepreneurs can act unimpeded? Even though they say AI should enable the smaller state, don't they really, when they talk about improving state capacity, mean just the opposite? And does the fact that these former opponents from left and right have come together really just highlight the fact that the new division now is between the technocratic elites versus the left and right ideologues and, in their fancy, all of the ordinary people? Indeed, that critical article ended with this question. Would Hague and Blair be in the same party if they were starting out today? And what about Rishi Sunak? Hague is his mentor after all. Would they be the gang of three in a new Davos-style social democratic party? For all that some people get rather ridiculous about what does or doesn't happen at Davos, that isn't an irrelevant question when it comes to framing the political choices that are taking shape. And people are wary because there are people openly discussing in peer-reviewed journals how maybe certain problems like climate change mean that we should circumvent democracy. To see how deep that rabbit hole goes, watch this video next.